G'day, May 40 here. Haven't been streaming much the last month, and I think it's time that I become more honest with you. I've had this profound sense of fatigue, and then this feeling of fatigue was followed by a deep, profound sense of emptiness. Now, luckily, I was able to interpret these feelings correctly. And I have great news this evening. I can assure you it has not recurred. Why? Well, women sense my power, mate, and they seek the life essence. I do not avoid women, but I do deny them my essence. So I think we're alone now. Doesn't seem to be anyone around now. So I don't want you to think of this as a very unpopular show, right? Think of this as you've been invited to a very exclusive party, right? So children behave, that's what they say when we're together, and watch how you play. They don't understand. And so we're running just as fast as we can, holding on to one another's hand, trying to get away into the night, and then you put your arms around me and we tumble to the ground, and then you say, I think we're alone now. There doesn't seem to be anyone around now. I think we're alone now. The beating of our hearts is the only sound. Okay, so I want to talk about the essential Jew, the essential Palestinian, the essential Muslim, right? There was a story in the New York Post, this doctor warning about Zionist doctors, right? And so I got Jewish friends who go, oh man, I never want to go to a Muslim doctor after this, right? Beverly Hills doctor acts for anti-Semitic post calling Zionists demonic and greedy. A Beverly Hills radiologist has been fired from his lucrative job after sharing an onslaught of anti-Semitic posts to his ex account that bash Zionists as genocidal, demonic, greedy, pedophilic racists. Changed my mind, added Dr. Andrew Thierry, who was fired from his position as chief medical officer at Expert MRI after the medical center was made aware of his disturbing anti-Semitic comments. Ahead of getting laid off, Thierry wrote in a separate post, the angry little Zionist war pigs are big mad. Their lies and deceit aren't working anymore. Their powers are waning. They are scared and they are lashing out. The only thing Zionists are superior at are lies, deceit, and genocide. So he was earning $173,000 a year. And then he took to X to issue an apology that if anyone had interpreted his words the wrong way. So a lot of people get, overheated social media, particularly with regard to what's going on in the, Arab-Israeli, Israeli-Gaza, Israeli-Hamas conflict. So Beverly Hills radiologist, man, Dr. Andrew Thierry. And then people on all sorts of ends of this conflict are saying some crazy things. Here's Sam Harris.
In the long term, it's hard to see how Israel is a viable project with the current assumptions of a so-called two-state solution. I don't know how it works. I mean, either they're not really states, or something has radically changed about the cultures. But there's no one-state solution, given what most Islamists and jihadists and conservatives among the Palestinians actually want, right? I mean, that's a recipe for at the minimum just a demographic change that is not compatible with the endurance of a Jewish state.
A demographic change where the entire Arab population of Gaza is relocated to a different country, and that the country is then subsumed into part of Israel. That would be like genocide, right? At least cultural.
No, it's not genocide. No. Genocide has a specific meaning.
Okay, genocide at very least, then it is a forced relocation.
Yeah, to say that people are moving 10 miles to somewhere else where they share the same language, same culture, and same religion, and to call that genocide, I think is just robs the word genocide of any meaning.
You mean ethnic cleansing? You mean ethnic cleansing, right? Which is a word, which is a phrase that's often used along with genocide, and they are worlds apart with respect to their moral implications. I mean, history is just full of ethnic cleansing, which means people moving, right? People who can't get along wind up moving apart, right? That happens
So I think Sam Harris makes some good points here, but of course I'd say that I'm a rabid Zionist, and Sam Harris is a Zionist too.
Hell of a lot. And it's, it can be awful in terms of, when done at the point of a sword, which happened under Islam again and again and again. I mean, nobody's losing sleep over the Jews that got run out of Syria and Yemen and Iraq and Egypt and Morocco, and all after 1948, right? Like, no one's talking about their right of return. What happened to their homes? The UN's not worrying about that, right? And yet everyone is worried about the Palestinians as this perpetual refugee population. What about all the people who left Syria in 2015 and went to Sweden, right? Okay, they've been.
But that,
do they have perpetual refugee status, or are they just now in Sweden?
So Sam, just to clarify, so you are saying that like ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip isn't extreme position? 2 million people
in the current. It's totally extreme. It is totally extreme in that it's a non-starter. I mean, no one in the Palestinian world wants that, right? And the Arab and if you look at the Arab states' contribution to the status quo over the last 50.
Okay, no one in the Palestinian world wants that. Well, it depends how bad things get. All right, if life in Gaza remains absolutely horrible, and there is a better living arrangement available elsewhere, right? I think a large number of people would rather move out of Gaza. I think that there is some basis for calling Gaza an open-air prison, but at least half the reason that Gaza is an open-air prison is because Egypt keeps it that way. Like Egypt, an Arab Muslim state, wants nothing to do with Palestinians.
Years, it has been very deliberately to hold the Palestinians in perpetual refugee status so as to put the existence of Israel in question perpetually. I completely understand the nationalistic and aspirations of the Palestinians, and there is an analogy to any other group of people that want their own nation. But the moral core of this problem and the asymmetry of it should be unignorable. This is, a statement that you've probably heard me make, and you've probably heard Douglas Murray make it, but it's nonetheless true, which is if the Palestinians put down their weapons, if they were peaceful, right? If they and even if they were peaceful protesters of a Gandhian sort, right? They would this problem would be solved, and the two societies could live happily together. There would be a two-state solution. There would have been a two-state solution decades ago. And if the Jews of Israel put down their weapons, there would be a genocide, right? October 7th reveals that to be as objectively true as a statement as we can make in this sort of area.
So the only point I was going to raise there is, like, you've had Netanyahu come out and say there won't be a two-state solution. We can't.
But that's because of who the Palestinians are, and because of how Islam is informing their worldview, right?
Okay, that's something I want to tackle because of how the Palestinians are, right? There's no essential Palestinian, right? The reason I deny women my essence is that I have no essence. I am different in different situations, right? In some workplaces, I am top 1% in my performance. In other workplaces, I would be bottom 1% in my performance, all right? You gave me a job as a National Football League quarterback, I would be bottom 1% in my performance. In some situations, I'm honest and trustworthy. In other situations, I'm dishonest and slimy, right? In some situations, I do the right thing. In other situations, I don't, all right? So the Palestinians are who the Palestinians are because of circumstances, in addition to their own ethnic, genetic heritage, religious, cultural influences, all right? But there's no essential Palestinian, all right? Just like there's no essential Jew, because Jews and Arabs and Muslims and all groups manifest differently. So in different situations. So I've got Jewish friends who say, oh, I'll never go to a Muslim doctor after reading a story about Dr. Andrew Thierry. And I think that's insane, because just knowing that your doctor is Muslim tells you nothing about him. Like, I would expect that most Muslims in the United States are fairly secular, right? Just knowing that your doctor is Jewish doesn't tell you almost anything about him. You'd have to understand, like, is he of German Jewish heritage? Is he Orthodox? Is he secular? right? You need to know a lot more. There isn't just an essential Christian, Palestinian, Israeli that you can just boil down and know who they are.
Islam were a peaceful religion, if Islam was Jainism.
In some situations, Islam's a peaceful religion. In other situations, Islam is a violent religion. In some situations, Christianity is a peaceful religion. In other situations, like certain Christians tend to be more peaceful than other Christians. Certain Muslims tend to be more peaceful than other Muslims, all right? Muslims in Southeast Asia tend to be fairly peaceful compared to the more robust Muslims of, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia and Iran. So different Muslims in different contexts behave differently. Different Jews, right? Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews largely lead separate lives. There's some intermarriage between these groups, but by and large, at the synagogues I've gone to, overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jews are primarily friends with other Ashkenazi Jews. Sephardi Jews are friends with other Sephardi Jews, and Mizrahi Jews, largely hang out with Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews.
And there was no notion of jihad. We would have a completely different situation, right? If they had a leader, if they were producing leaders like Gandhi, right?
The reason that Palestinians haven't produced leaders like Gandhi is because any Palestinian who acted like Gandhi in this current situation would be killed, right? The Palestinians are who they are because they have been in a rather unfortunate situation, right? Who would wish to be in the situation of the Palestinians? So it's not like Palestinians just essentially support Hamas. In dire situations, right, Palestinians and other people support dire solutions to their problems. In more peaceful, prosperous situations, Palestinians are less likely to support Hamas, right? Palestinian support for Hamas waxes and wanes depending upon the incentives that Palestinians have, right? Israeli support for extreme right politics varies depending upon circumstance, right? When you are in a situation where you feel like your life is under threat, your people are under threat, all right, you're more likely to support extreme solutions. In a prosperous environment where you have all sorts of incentives to cooperate with outgroups and to trade with outgroups, right, you're going to have a more tolerant liberal attitude.
Or Martin Luther King Jr., right? It would be a completely different situation. And again, Netanyahu is awful and again culpable for the disaster he's presiding over, right? So Israel needs better leaders, right? But he is reacting to the ongoing reality of what.
You know who also is reacting to the ongoing reality? Palestinians, Hamas, Iran, right? Iran started pushing for nuclear weapons in a particularly intense way after they saw the United States knock over the governments of Afghanistan and Iraq, right? When you start bullying people in a neighborhood, right? Other people in that neighborhood are going to pay attention and then try to find ways to defend themselves. Right? It's not like there's just some essential inherent quality of mullahs or of Islam or of the Iranians that is just inherently, demonic or bloodthirsty or set on exploding nuclear weapons. In different circumstances, the Iranian people would have different interests. But in large part, because of choices that the United States has made, disastrous choices in the Middle East, right? The Iranians have reacted, and understandably, in their own self-interest, they want to push the United States out of the Middle East. And that is what they're incentivized to do.
What the Palestinians and even the surrounding Muslim states have wanted since Israel was born 70 some odd years ago, right? And it's that, and so much of the conversation, it has been explicitly genocidal as to make anything.
So when do you start having genocidal conversations? When do you start having genocidal rhetoric? When life is good, when your life is prosperous, when there are great incentives to do deals and to trade and to work with outgroups, right? No, then people don't talk about genocide. But in dire situations where there is an intense conflict of interests, right? And you are geographically inseparable, that's when you get genocide, right? Genocide just doesn't emerge out of the Bible or out of the Quran or out of Machiavelli's The Prince, right? Genocide emerges out of a situation where you have an intense clash of interests by two people who are stuck living together, and it's inherently unstable until one side wins out over the other.
Other than a very strong defensive posture, unthinkable for the Israelis.
And all those same circumstances, right? They also affect how Palestinians behave, right? The more prosperity and good things that the Palestinians see on the horizon, the less likely they are to support extreme solutions. The more you have going on in your life that's positive, the less likely you are to support extreme politics, right? The more you lose at life, then the more likely you are to buy into extreme solutions. As my therapist said to me many years ago, said, I wonder if you're into such extreme politics because you're so passive in how you lead your life, right? You're not, building up a career. You're not earning a great deal of money. You're just scraping by in a passive way in your real life, and then talking about all sorts of, extreme solutions in politics. All right, let's go to GoodFellows from the Hoover Institute.
Does this really change matters in the Middle East? Does all of this retaliatory action, does it really move us forward toward deterrence?
It can play a role in restoring deterrence, Bill, but you don't really accomplish outcomes with strikes, right? And my friend and historian Conrad Crane had a great essay in the early 2000s called "The Lure of the Strike," and it makes you feel good. And a lot of times, it's important to impose costs on an enemy like Iran's proxy network that go beyond the costs that they factor in when they conduct aggression against us. And that aggression was at least 165 attacks against U.S. facilities and U.S. personnel since October.
So Elliot Blatt says, I'm a total bottom. And you're saying that, bro, is that's a bad thing. I mean, that's just your hero system. In your hero system, being a total bottom is a bad thing. But in a different hero system, being a total bottom is like the greatest thing you can possibly be.
7th, since the horrendous attack against Israel. So you can it's a step in the right direction, Bill, but it's not going to be decisive in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking to a Jewish friend yesterday, and I wanted to talk to him. He's probably centrist to center left in his politics, consistently votes for the Democrats. And I was just curious what he thought of Israel's invasion of Gaza. And he thought that, Israel had to do it. And then he said, well, what do I think? And I said, on balance, if you push me to the wall, I think it's a mistake. But then 5 minutes later, I changed my mind because I don't know how Israel can live with a cascade of rockets coming at it from Gaza. So if there was just like a one-off October 7 type attack, I don't think that would necessitate an invasion of Gaza. But then if you've got ongoing rocket attacks from Gaza, then I don't know how you can just make peace with it. All right, History Speaks writes on Twitter, Sam Harris very much mask off here. He opposes a two-state solution on the grounds of jihad, says it's unviable because of who the Palestinians are. Well, I agree with History Speaks here that there's not an essence to Palestinians. Palestinian behavior, like Jewish behavior or Indian behavior, depends upon circumstances. Sam Harris opposes a one-state solution on the grounds of maintaining a Jewish demographic majority. Why should an atheist care about this? Because people care about people. All right, people care about people that are similar to them. People tend to care about their tribe and their in-group more than they care about out-group. And he insinuates that ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is morally acceptable. Well, compared to mass slaughter or mass misery, sometimes the moving of one people is a superior solution. Sam Harris cites low-information demagogue Douglas Murray as the foundation for his views on Netanyahu, says he's just defending against jihad. No mention of the religiously inspired
in the long term
to settlement of the Likud party. Wish I could debate this clown. He knows. I wouldn't say Sam Harris knows nothing. I just say that he's got a different hero system from History Speaks.
Yep.
I'm struggling to make sense of the administration's Middle East policy. We've discussed this before, but I could never really understand why.
Yeah, I don't understand why either, but for completely different reasons from Neil Ferguson. I think that American foreign policy should be primarily based on American interests. And I would see that we are way overly involved in the Middle East. And it would be in America's interest to increasingly disengage and instead concentrate on stymieing the rise of China.
They wanted to try to resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal, cut some slack to Tehran, and in the process, I think inadvertently derail what had been going so well under the previous administration, the Abraham Accords, and the progress towards reconciliation between Israel and the Arab states. It never seemed likely to me to work, and it always had an obvious downside risk that Iran would feel emboldened and would also be financially in a better position to encourage.
And Elliot Blatt says, my understanding is that the average Gazan IQ is 73. I'm positive it's much higher than that. I would suspect that even in these difficult situations, it's probably in the low 80s. And in a different situation, I suspect that it would approach 90. Right? There's a ton of cousin marriage in the Middle East, which depresses IQ. So if they would abandon these low IQ practices, I'm sure they could push into the 90s.
Its proxies in the region to make trouble. And this is exactly what's happened. And it's happened in ways that the administration clearly didn't expect. Otherwise, Jake Sullivan wouldn't have published his essay in Foreign Affairs, confidently saying that all was well in the region, only days before catastrophe.
So Noam Chomsky, when he would be asked for a title for a lecture, he would, for decades, he'd say the crisis in the Middle East, because he was confident that at whatever time and circumstance the lecture would take place, there would be some crisis in the Middle East. And that's in large part due to the combination of genetics and geography and intense conflicts of interest in areas where you've got two peoples with diametrically opposed visions.
Struck on October the 7th. I don't think Iran is being deterred by any of this. My sources in the region say that these attacks are very carefully calibrated and signposted so that they have almost a demonstrative quality, symbolic rather than militarily valuable quality, and they don't direct.
Okay, so they are discussing here United States attacks against the Houthis. So I'm curious. I mean, do you lose sleep about attacks on the Houthis? Do you lose sleep on the suffering in Gaza? I mean, Gazans are suffering terribly, but because my in-group, right, Jews, is engaged in intense conflict with this out-group, Gazans, I don't lose sleep over Gazan suffering, though I have to just objectively note that it's huge. It's a tremendous amount of suffering in Gaza, and therefore I don't expect Gazans to care one bit about Jewish suffering. Right, when you have an intense conflict of interest, right, you have essentially what appears to be a battle to the death between these groups.
Directly hurt Iran. And Iran therefore feels it can continue to make mischief in the region with something close to impunity until Iran is made to pay a price for the antics of its proxies. It's hard.
Okay, so make Iran pay a price. So what happens, right, if you make Iran pay a price? Do you think Iran just licks its wounds and think, oh, we better not be naughty anymore, we've just paid a price? No, what in all likelihood happen is that Iran fights back hard, and Iran could do us tremendous damage. Just a few hit squads going off in the United States could, end life as we know it in major cities. So the GoodFellows here from the Hoover Institute talk as though if we just get tough on this group or that group, that these bad outgroups will learn their lesson. But instead, what will happen is that they will fight back hard, and we'll have a conflagration that's very much against America's best interests.
Highly disruptive antics, because not only are lives being lost, but global trade is being subjected to considerable distortion by the actions of the Houthis in the Red Sea. I think the.
So I think different groups, have some different tendencies and some different gifts. Okay, so prior to about the 14th century, there was no widespread notion that Jews were particularly smart. But since the 15th century, there's been a widespread notion that Ashkenazi Jews in particular are above average in intelligence. But you put Ashkenazi Jews in a particularly miserable situation, you put them in a situation where they increasingly marry out of their group, then Ashkenazi average IQ will decline, as it is, I believe, in Israel and in Europe and in the United States. You put people like the Koreans, right? 80 years ago, they had relatively low IQ scores, and then circumstances changed, and now they're thriving. And so it seems like the average IQ for the people of Northeast Asia, whether Japan, China, Korea, is all around 105 to 107. So circumstances change, you unleash prosperity, and in different situations, people's innate abilities can come to the fore. So you can raise children in certain situations, and parents can act on children like you act on a rubber ball. You can press and compress, and you can strongly incentivize them to be one way. But when they become adults, when they become independent, they will increasingly follow their own innate trajectory unless you have committed so much harm against them that it becomes very difficult for them to follow the direction of their innate abilities.
Region is going to be in a very unstable state. And I was much struck by Bill Burns's article in Foreign Affairs, which struck.
Am I going to acknowledge Black History Month? I'm a quiver of a Black History Month, bro. It's about, frankly, pretty much the only topic I've talked about in my private life for the last 22 days. So this is the first time I have gone 25 minutes of my waking hours not rejoicing in Black History Month.
A very different tone from the article Jake Sullivan published. This is an article just came out by the Director of Central Intelligence saying that he cannot remember seeing the Middle East in a more dangerous state than it is now. But I have to say that's a
powerful, powerful statement here from Elliot Blatt. He is going to block Hamas on Twitter. Right? That's something that we can all do to make the world a better place.
Terrible indictment of the administration's policy. I think this could be salvaged, but it's getting.
So my critique of administration policy is that we're overly involved and overly aggressive in the Middle East. Niall Ferguson's critique is that we're insufficiently aggressive and insufficiently launching military attacks in the Middle East.
It's getting harder and harder, because I'll say one more thing. I still don't really see a good end game for Israel in Gaza that doesn't leave Israel exposed to attack from Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so the core of this.
Yeah, so I expect going to see Israel invade southern Lebanon to try to squash Hezbollah. But going back to the essence, all right, we do have genetic tendencies, right? There are genes, genetics, and then there are how genes express, and that will depend in part upon the environment. So you have the genetics, the genotype, and then the phenotype, which is how the gene expresses itself. That expression will often depend upon the environment. So there's no inherent quality to Jew, Muslim, Christian, white, black, Asian, right? Different peoples often have different innate abilities, but these abilities will express themselves completely differently depending upon circumstance.
This problem, which is the greater insecurity Israel has been experiencing, looks very difficult to fix. And it's almost impossible to see it getting fixed if the Biden administration is not only doing too little to deter Iran, but it seems more concerned to lean on Israel to.
Right. The more we do to deter Iran, the more Iran will be incentivized to become vicious.
Wind up its military operation against Hamas. In short, I find the strategy baffling, and I don't see a good end game.
Well, let me try to be I'll be the simpleton here who gets to
baffle us, please.
I'll put up the view that you guys can swat down, and maybe that'll make you more effective. It seems to me we're at the stage of the stage of a bar fight where the two guys are pushing each other to show who's tougher. And my initial reaction was, I've never been in a bar fight, but the advice I've heard is land the first punch and land it well. Sort of what HR said, sort of the Powell doctrine. We don't do things for show. You do things only to completely diminish the opponent's ability to fight, and you fight to win. But there's a good Wall Street Journal article that I sent around, and we talked a little bit about email that led me to rethink things. And here we're kind of turning around on Ukraine. Originally, I was the hawk, and Neil was, we don't want to escalate and endanger that thing. And here I'm wondering, I've been influenced to think that maybe what the Biden administration is doing is not so bad. Iran clearly wants to keep out of a major war. They want to have their proxies cause trouble, but just enough to stay out of a major war. And it's not clear Iran completely controls these guys. They all have their independent ideas of what to do. Some of them are Sunni, some of them are Shiites, and some of them are Persians, and not everybody here gets along, just to start with. Where are we? There has been no Hezbollah war yet. Saudi Arabia still quietly wants to pursue. So
we do know Palestinian political preferences. We have enough polling that's solid enough. We know that support for Hamas and some Palestinian support for these kind of violent extreme groups, right, grows. The more depressed Palestinians become about their prospects, the more optimistic they become about their prospects, right, then the less they support these extreme groups like Hamas.
A peace accord with Israel eventually, that involves some sort of promises about two-state solution, and nobody ever talks about exactly what that means. Will the Palestinian state say, yeah, we recognize the right to Israel to exist as a Jewish state? That's sort of like number one, and that's the one that isn't happening. But is it so bad to try to keep this at the pushing stage of the bar fight and keep it from turning into a major war? Attacking Iran would turn it into the major war that we're trying to dance around not doing. So why am I so dumb here?
I'd just like to point out that the problem with that, John, is that Iran is pursuing a strategy based on the ideology of the revolution and the objectives, the associated objectives to really expand Iran's hegemonic influence across the region, push the United States out of the region as the first step in what that ultimately seeks is the destruction of Israel.
They did not send Hezbollah to start a major war, so they're willing to do this so long as it doesn't involve a big war with Iran.
Well, right now they're doing everything on their own terms because they're holding back the 150,000 or so rockets in Hezbollah to deter Israel and deter us from direct strikes on Iran. And what that
Wait, this is I'm playing the wrong video. That's not like me. Right, this is the video I intended to play.
Forces are defeating Hamas, and they are probably a couple of months away from completely destroying Hamas, not only as a terrorist.
Okay, so yeah, this is Niall Ferguson saying that he sees a lot of good news in the Middle East. Here he is with John Cochrane, the economist at Stanford, and Dan Senor in Israel.
Which means there's one man left out here, which I'll make my case to Professor Cochrane later on to come onto the Comic Back podcast. But we've had HR and we've had Neil.
Yes, so if we had more time on the show, I'd ask you. You did a show with Mike Murphy once, Dan, where I think you mentioned that Neil is one of your most popular guests. I'd like to get the background on that, but maybe when you have you back again. So let's go to Neil, who is sitting in Jerusalem right now, having just come out of meetings with high-ranking Israeli officials. Neil, to the extent you can tell us what we discussed, tell us what you learned today.
Well, I learned today and yesterday that the Israeli Defense Forces are defeating Hamas, and they are probably a couple of months away from completely destroying Hamas, not only as a terrorist force, but as the de facto government of Gaza. And they are very reluctant indeed to heed international calls, including calls from...
Okay, so that sounds amazing, but at what price, right? You don't think there's going to be blowback if it's true that approximately 30,000 Gazans have been killed in the process of destroying Hamas, right? It sounds good to destroy Hamas, but have you created even more dire incentives for more extreme versions of groups, like Hamas? Like, you can't kill the idea, right? You've destroyed this military force, perhaps, but have you done so at the price of creating even stronger incentives for this kind of extreme terrorism to rebound out of Gaza?
U.S. officials to have a ceasefire before this job is done. The other thing that I'm very struck by, and this is based not just on conversations with officials, but also conversations with ordinary Israelis from a broad spectrum. I've been doing my level best to sample opinion right across from the ultra-Orthodox to the secular left. Ordinary Israelis are done with two-state solutions as a conversation topic. They're done with it. And they feel...
And that means what? Okay. The significance is what? Okay. If circumstances change so that a two-state solution looks more appealing than alternatives, then Israeli opinion will change, right? It's not like there's this transcendent righteousness to collective opinion, be it in Israel or anywhere else. You can be collectively wrong, right? People are collectively wrong all the time.
However much they may disagree on certain political issues, they feel to me very united in regarding this as quite inappropriate thing to discuss in the way.
And so united is often good, right? It feels good to be united with the people around you. Then circumstances change, and then there are more incentives for expressing and following disagreement, and more openness to intercourse with outgroups. So yeah, under times of threat, right, when your in-group feels like it's fighting for its life, it's going to be united, and it's going to be strongly opposed and strongly critical, and feeling all sorts of revulsion towards outgroups. And in certain circumstances, that's an adaptive reaction. Circumstances change, right? Then you have more incentives for trade and other forms of intercourse with outgroups.
Wake of the horrendous terrorist attacks of October the 7th. That feeling is very striking to me. I found greater national unity here than I think I was anticipating. I know, Dan, that you've been here recently too. I'd be interested to compare notes, but those are my two impressions. The government is not about to stop this war against Hamas, regardless of what is said to them internationally, and people are broadly speaking behind this effort.
So this is, I think, what Tom Sowell would call stage one thinking, right? Stage one, let's say Israel destroys Hamas. Okay, what happens stage two? Like, what happens next? What's the price, right? On the face of it, sounds like a wonderful thing, right? Sounds fantastic, but at what price? And what will be the consequences? And what happens now? And what were the alternatives, right? The United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11, and these were disastrous choices. Instead of taking a military option, right, the United States would have been better served taking a law enforcement option, mounting raids and drone attacks to take out Al-Qaeda, and forming alliances and cutting off their funding. Instead, we wasted $7 trillion and thousands upon thousands of lives invading and occupying Afghanistan and Iraq. And so too, I don't know if Israel's invasion of Gaza is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm certainly not strongly opposed or strongly supportive of it.
And very uninterested in talk of a two-state solution.
Yeah, let's go to Dan. You did a Call Me Back episode recently with your sister, Dan, that was just heart-wrenching, and her talking about the climate in Israel. Compare it to what you experienced, what Neil just said.
And you don't think people could do absolutely heart-wrenching videos with residents of Gaza? What, 90% of buildings have been severely damaged, if not destroyed, in Gaza. Approximately 29,000 people supposedly have been killed. Right, the Arab-Israeli conflict has been brutal for both sides. Right, both sides have legitimate reasons to feel victimized.
I had the same impression that Neil has. When I was there, I was meeting with a range of officials both in and outside the government, and even within the coalition government. There's a range of views, obviously, because many of the members of the government, including members of the war cabinet, are bitter political enemies. You know, Netanyahu and Gantz basically hate each other personally. Gadi Eisenkot, who's a part of Gantz's party, and he's in the war cabinet, also has been very public in his criticism of Netanyahu. And yet, on the issues that Neil just spoke about, there's more or less unity. I went there in these meetings I had in Israel looking for daylight, and if you follow the press over here in the West, you're going there.
Right, so they're talking as though unity is automatically a good thing and that it's a significant thing. Right? Sometimes unity is a good thing. Yeah, it feels good to be unified, but it's a terrible thing when you're unified and heading in the wrong direction.
Expecting there to be a lot of daylight, and there's virtually none. So take, for example, the issue of the two-state solution and this effort by the U.S.
Bibi Netanyahu wants to stay in power. Bibi Netanyahu is strongly incentivized to keep the war going because when the war's over, right, he's out of power. Right? Bibi Netanyahu's incentives do not necessarily align with the overall incentives of the Jewish state of Israel.
And the UN and some Arab capitals and the EU to try to push forward a very quick declaration of recognition of a Palestinian state. The Israeli cabinet put out a statement on Sunday during their cabinet meeting that every member of the cabinet signed off on, including Gantz, including Eisenkot, that basically said, no way, we are not starting this process with a declaration of a Palestinian state. We are not going to make, they didn't use these words, these are my words, but we're not going to make October 7th Palestinian Independence Day. And that position is held across.
Bro, Donovan Walland is in the chat. Long time no see, no talk. Donovan, yes, who will become the benefactor? The Palestinians, Qatar, the Saudis, Jordan, Al-Sisi apparatus in Egypt, or Iran? We will inevitably see. Ricardo, blessings. Wow, the whole gang is here. I should take 3 weeks off more often.
Across the board. And then you think about the political constituencies that could be for a Palestinian state in Israel, which did once exist and was very vibrant. A lot of it was
yeah, right now there's very little Israeli support for a Palestinian state. Circumstances change and Israeli opinion will change. Right? Israeli public opinion on a Palestinian state is not written in heaven.
Wiped out figuratively during the Second Intifada. So meaning the left in Israel was dramatically weakened during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s when there were 140 suicide bombings, over 1,000 Israelis slaughtered. And this was after Ehud Barak had went to Camp David and basically offered Yasser.
Yeah, over 1,000 Israeli slaughtered, and as someone who converted to Judaism, that's the number that's of great significance to me. But there may very well have been 5,000 Palestinians killed in that conflict. And because Palestinians are in a life and death struggle with my in-group, right, I don't feel a great deal of empathy but for Palestinian suffering, but I have to objectively realize that Palestinians suffer terribly. And they do have very strong claims to the very land on which the Jewish state exists.
Arafat, everything, right? He offered a Palestinian state. He offered East Jerusalem as the capital. I mean, he was willing to deal with every issue, and Arafat walked out, and Israel got the Second Intifada. So that wiped out a lot of the left's, the political support for a two-state solution. And now what was left with
it's striking how pro-Israel Fox News has become. It was always the most pro-Israel of the major channels, but they'd have on Palestinian voices, they would have on critical coverage of Israel, and now Fox News is just fallen in line behind Israel in such a uniform way. I just don't recall anything like it. I mean, is there any major pundit in the United States on any major network or major publication who is anti-Israel or particularly pro-Palestine? I can't think of one. It seems like overwhelmingly the most successful, highest paid, most visible pundits are uniformly pro-Israel.
Then the Israeli political left in the last few years was largely populated in southern Israel, in those kibbutzim. That is where the peace activists lived and were organizing and were working on coexistence with the Palestinian Gazans. And those are the people who are sitting in tunnels today, being held hostage.
Yeah, so the Israelis who were slaughtered in the October 7 attack were more likely than not people on the left, people who wanted a peaceful solution with the Palestinians. And so evolution has its way, right? In dire circumstances where you make yourself vulnerable to an outgroup that hates you, right, you're not going to be around very long in all likelihood to propagate your genes as much as a group that takes a more skeptical view of outgroups. On the other hand, when circumstances change and it's more profitable and it's a better way to accumulate resources and to lead a good life, is to have vigorous interchange with outgroups and trade and intercourse with outgroups, then a more open attitude will be more likely to help you propagate your genes. It's not like there's always a right-wing solution. It's always best to an egalitarian, open, liberal, tolerant, left-wing attitude. All right. In certain circumstances, it's more beneficial to have an openness to outgroups. In other circumstances, it's more beneficial to have great suspicion of outgroups. Right. The settlers are not particularly open to inter-religious dialogue or great intimacy with Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs. And as a result, it'd be much more difficult for Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims to slaughter settlers, because Israeli settlers are highly suspicious of outgroups. They have a very strong in-group identity. The Israelis who lived next to Gaza in southern Israel had a weaker in-group identity, that had greater openness and tolerance of outgroups such as Palestinians and Muslims. As a result, they employed many Palestinians and Gazans, and they brought them into their communities, and they did all sorts of nice things for them. They transported them to hospitals. As a result, the Gazans had a map for where to go to kill Jews. And so those Jews who made a choice of being overly open and vulnerable to an outgroup that hated them, many of them had to pay the ultimate price.
Kibbutzim were the ones that were raided. In 2014, which was the last time there was a major Israel-Gaza war with a serious ground troop presence, lasted about 50 days. It was those.
Ricardo, yeah, good point. Luke Ford on the move better than Luke Ford in his studio. The difference is Luke Ford in his studio has better sound quality, and I can play more clips. The great thing of being on the move is that I can't read. I have to speak, and you think differently when you're moving, right? You speak differently when you're moving, right? It's not like there's just the brain, right? Just like there aren't just the Palestinians or the Jews, right? The brain operates differently when we're moving compared to when we're standing, compared to when we're lying down, to when we're seated, when we're in nature, all right? Depending on the circumstance that our brain is operating in, we operate completely differently. So yeah, many ways, 40 on the move is much more compelling, much more interesting, perhaps, more likable, more provocative, more thoughtful, less stilted on the move than when he is standing still, let alone sitting still inside.
Those Israelis in the south that led the protest movement inside Israel, calling on the Israeli government to stop the war because they wanted peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians in Gaza. And those are the Israelis that were slaughtered on October 7th, and their communities were destroyed, and many of them are being held hostage today. So, like, there's nobody in Israel right.
There's a great book by a journalist came out last 3 years called The Extended Mind. It talks about how we think differently when we're outside compared to inside. We think differently when we're standing up compared to sitting down. We think differently when we're talking with others opposed to being on our own, right? We are happier and more careful when we are thinking around other people than when we're at home alone, right? When we come home, we tend to be much more slovenly in our dress, in our thinking, in our speech, right? How we dress changes how we think, right? I think differently wearing a jacket and a nice collared shirt than if I were just in sweats and a t-shirt. We think differently when we're around trees and free-flowing streams and waterfalls and a beautiful ocean than when we're around skyscrapers. Like, I get a lot of energy from being in downtown Los Angeles, right? The skyscrapers that kind of emit a masculine energy, or New York City, throbs with an energy that you don't find in Los Angeles. So place, company, activity all have a profound effect on how we think.
Now, nobody really, like on any of the fringes, nowhere can you find people that are arguing that this is the moment to declare a Palestinian state.
Can I ask you guys, and what about in Washington? It's hard for me to understand what our leaders are after here. When they say two-state solution, I would think the first part of the two-state solution is, oh, you guys who want your state, you have to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state within given borders, and to be peaceful about that. That has to be institutional, encoded in an irrevocable way. I'm not just, or is it just here? You know, Palestinian, the PLO, the one organization everybody hates, right in the center. Here, you get your own country, and you know the route to importing the rockets is over here. So what are they talking about when they say Palestinian state in Washington, in Saudi Arabia, and so forth? I presume there's something more concrete than just that. And second, does nobody think about aloud? So a lot of people around the world who want their own state. You know, the Kurds would like their own state. The Uyghurs would like their own state. Is the answer is you get your own state if you kill enough Jews? You know, do we reward terrorism here? I can't imagine that hasn't occurred to them. So the question, sorry to wind around to the question, in Washington, in Saudi Arabia, in the UN, in all the worthies who say two-state solution, what are they talking?
Yeah, often people have gotten their own state because they killed people. In fact, that has been the most common way that you get new states, is because you've killed people. I wish the world didn't operate this way. I wish people got new states because they wrote beautiful poetry, composed powerful symphonies, did compelling live streams. The way the world works is that when you frighten and intimidate people, right, you often are more likely to get your way, right? There are dozens of new states over the past 80 years because the most committed advocates for those new states committed violence, right? Israel was created, one state of Israel, through violence.
Talking about, and is there anything vaguely coherent here?
Neil, you want to take it or should I?
Dan, I think you should go ahead, because this is much more your turf than mine.
So I don't think they really know what they mean when they say Palestinian state. I think different parties here have different views in mind, I think, and different agendas. I think the Biden administration has a domestic political concern, which is they need to get images of chaos in Gaza off the front page of the press and off of TikTok. And they need to be shown, in their mind, this is their view, and I'm not saying I agree with them, but in their view, the people around Biden need to bring down the temperature on the Palestinian issue and on the Hamas war issue inside the United States heading to 2024, because they're concerned about the risk, or they're concerned about the, shall we say, deflated enthusiasm among the progressive base. And so,
But Israel is somewhat an ethno-state. It is somewhat an ethnic state if you are not on the right, if you don't have a traditional tribal way of viewing the world, you're not going to be thrilled with ethno-states. You're not going to be thrilled with the tribal outlook on life. The tribal outlook on life is very different from the modern liberal secular left-wing outlook on life. So, of course, people in the left-wing party in the United States are not going to be big supporters of an ethno-state like Israel.
somehow this issue has become representative to them of an issue that they need to deal with in order to deal with the lack of enthusiasm among the progressive base as Biden heads into a re-election. We can get into that. I think they are overthinking it. I'm skeptical that them dealing with the Israel-Gaza issue is going to deal with their progressive base enthusiasm problem. But be that as it may, there's enough people around Biden saying that. And there are enough players in Arab capitals who they want two things, John. They want Hamas destroyed. Like everybody I speak to in the Arab world, really, like they all want Hamas gone. And they also don't want this to be a political headache for them in their own countries to the extent it's a problem on the quote-unquote Arab street. So they want Hamas gone.
Who do you think is more popular on the Arab street, Hamas or Israel? Right, I suspect that the Arab street, by a ratio of 50-1, at least, favors Hamas over Israel. Now, Arab elites tend not to be big fans of Hamas, but the Arab street are big fans of Hamas. Just like American elites are rarely fans of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump has a pretty steadfast constituency among about 40% of Americans.
They want Israel to finish the job, but they want to be seen to be throwing a bone, providing something positive to the peaceful quote unquote Palestinian civilians that have been as victimized by Hamas as anybody. That is their view. They need to show some momentum on that front. What does that actually mean practically?
I mean, they're talking as though the moral quality of a people determines its success in the world, determines whether or not it merits statehood. That getting your own state is largely a matter of displaying a certain amount of moral excellence. That's completely absurd. Like, why do we have a state of Pakistan? Because of a violent civil war in India.
It means what is emerging is some sort of declaration that there's going to be a Palestinian state. In Tony Blinken's words, a time-bound and irreversible, his words, which to me are the two of the most dangerous words I've heard in talking about a Palestinian.
Right. So in northern England, there were these Pakistani immigrants to England who developed all sorts of grooming gangs, right? That's not an inherent part of being Pakistani. That was an expression of a certain number of Pakistanis facing certain incentives, right? If there'd been capital punishment for that type of behavior, right, you wouldn't have had grooming gangs, right? So it was a combination of certain Pakistani immigrants, right, taking advantage of a dissolute, permissive, and anatomized part of English society.
Palestinian state, time-bound and irreversible. Now, keep in mind that language has never been used before by the U.S. government. The basis for negotiations that could lead to a Palestinian state have always been about the parties negotiating with one another directly, Israelis and Palestinians, without preconditions. Just get to the table and negotiate. And it's not time-bound and irreversible. It's absolutely reversible. Meaning, if Hamas or Hamas 2.0 takes over the political leadership of a quasi-Palestinian state, you bet the process is reversible. So the fact that Blinken
Right, the PLO used to be primarily a terrorist organization. Then it struck some sort of accord with the Jewish state of Israel. Now the PLO is Fatah and is the reigning, conventional representative of, Arabs on the West Bank, and many people want Fatah, which was the PLO, to take over in Gaza. So you have terrorist organizations all the time then find their way to what's now regarded as legitimate government. All right, people supported the IRA, and then there was a political accord, and people who formerly supported terrorism took part in terrorist organizations such as the IRA that melded into a liberal democratic state.
Use the word irreversible to me is quite alarming. And in the past, historically, it's always been milestone based, meaning this is the path we are on. If the Palestinians meet certain milestones, then they will get more and more instruments and assets of sovereignty on a path towards full sovereignty. I don't think it would ever be full sovereignty. I mean, I don't think anyone wants a future Palestinian state to have its own military or its own airport or jurisdiction over its own.
Okay, a state that doesn't have its own military and its own airport is only a rump of a state. So when he says, I don't think anyone wants that, yeah, he's saying none of his friends want that. But I'm sure that there are millions of Palestinians who want that.
Own airspace. But basically, any path to sovereignty is going to have to be.
So if there were peace between Palestinians and Israelis, what would happen? The Israeli economy would boom, and Palestinians would live next door to a booming economy, while their own economy would just sputter along. So you really think that they would live at peace next to a group that they have a long enmity towards, who's vastly excelling them in many, many areas, right? You really think that they would live at ease and peacefully in that sort of humiliating situation?
Be milestone based. That's how it's historically been talked about. I'm surprised, as I said, to some degree alarmed by how the administration is not talking about milestones. They're talking about making a move quickly and immediately towards a Palestinian state. I don't know what that means. I don't think there's any political leadership in any Palestinian faction ready to take on up the leadership of the state. So I think it's sort of like an empty declaration. It's just they want to be able to say the administration and the government.
I don't know how empty it is. There is widespread loathing of Israel's behavior in Gaza, and in turn, there is widespread sympathy for the Palestinian people, just like there was widespread sympathy for Jews after World War II, after the Holocaust. And in part because of that widespread sympathy for Jews after World War II, you got the Jewish state. Now there's widespread sympathy around the world for the Palestinian people. All right, it's not far-fetched to think that as a result, powerful nations will move heaven and earth to create a Palestinian state.
In the Arab capitals wants to be able to tell all the respective constituencies, look, we're doing something. We've done something never done before. We're declaring and recognizing a Palestinian state. That's never done before. We're not sure what that means. We're not sure who's going to lead it. We're not sure what the path is, but it's happening.
Do you really think people are primarily interested in doing good or in feeling good, right? There's a vast desire among many nations right now to feel better about the Palestinians, right? So doing something that works is very different from doing something that feels good. And people generally prefer to do things that feel good rather than things that actually work.
And it's irreversible. The spaceship has taken off. They want it. They want that message. And again, to my earlier point, John, I just think, first of all, I don't think that's what Hamas wants, so we can get into that. But I just think the message to the Palestinian people and to the broader Arab world is a very dangerous message to say the West has never recognized a Palestinian state ever. October 7th happens.
Yeah, there hadn't been a functioning Jewish state, right, for 1900 years, and then it happened, right? We've got 50 different states in the world today that were created in large part through terrorism and through violence.
The biggest massacre of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust, and now we declare a Palestinian state.
And there was a previous vision, the Abraham Accord vision at least, which is, why don't we get you guys to be rich first, get prosperous, make a lot of money, and then we can.
So what primarily motivates people? Is it to be rich or to be proud? People have hero systems. Right? The Palestinians are not going to be at peace, even if they became 3 times richer than they are now, if the Jewish state next to them is 5 times richer per capita than they are and is excelling them in all sorts of areas like entrepreneurship, science, academic, literary contributions. I think Palestinians are just going to live in peace next to a state that vastly excels them.
Talk about political stuff afterwards, which as an economist always struck me like a great idea.
Yeah, I'd like to point you gentlemen to 2 dates on the calendar. One is Sunday, the February the 26th. This is Vladimir Putin. We're going to talk about Putin in the second segment of the show, inviting leaders of Hamas and PLO to Moscow for what he called a, quote, inter-Palestinian.
And so why is Putin in bed with Hamas? Because they share common interests. Right? This wouldn't have happened if the United States had not so vigorously gone to bat for Ukraine and armed and educated and trained Ukraine and essentially made Ukraine a de facto member of NATO, right? That creates a situation where Russia and in general and Vladimir Putin in particular are strongly incentivized to create as much trouble for the United States as possible. And so Russia and Putin all over the world are creating trouble for the United States, and aiding Hamas to attack Israel creates a tremendous headache for the United States. There's like only so much cognitive processing our leaders can handle. And so the biggest competitor of the United States is China, but we're distracted from that because we are so deeply involved with Israel. Right? The United States has been distracted by conflicts that have nothing to do with America's national interests, right? The conflict over Ukraine and the conflict over Israel and Gaza, right? These are conflicts that have virtually nothing to do with American national interests, and we're being distracted from conflicts that are vital to American national interests, such as the rise of China. And so Russia and Putin would not have been incentivized to create trouble like what happened October 7 in southern Israel if the United States had not created a situation where Russia felt like they had to invade Ukraine to prevent the development of an armed and dangerous enemy on its flank.
Palestinian meeting. Neil, you are a criminologist on the show. I'm dubbing you as that. I'd like you to maybe get some thoughts on what you think Putin's up to. Then Dan, I'd like you to weigh in on Rafah. We had Netanyahu the other day saying that Israel will assault that city. This is the southernmost city in Gaza. It's a population of about 1.5 million people, which is about the size of Philadelphia. Anyway, Netanyahu has said that if the hostages aren't freed by the first day of Ramadan, which is Sunday, March the 10th, Israel's going in. So Neil, why don't you give some thoughts on Putin, and then Dan, Rafah. And Rafah, is it really, Dan? I've seen the phrase key flashpoint. Is it really a key flashpoint this war? Neil, you go first.
Well, before I came to Jerusalem, I was at the Munich Security Conference, which should really be renamed the Munich Insecurity Conference, in which Europeans couldn't decide what they were more worried about. Was it Vladimir Putin gaining ground in Ukraine, or was it Donald Trump gaining ground in US opinion polls? But worried they were. And one of my reasons for being there was to try and explain, especially to our German hosts, why they needed to spend a little bit more than 1.5% of GDP.
Oh, yeah. They needed Neil Ferguson to tell them who to worry about. In some senses, Donald Trump is more of a threat to them than Vladimir Putin. Right? Putin is not going to invade Poland. Right? He's not going to invade Estonia. Right? He's not even going to invade and take over all of Ukraine.
On their defense. And they needed to do it not just because Russia is in Ukraine and not just.
Yeah, who is paying these talking heads? Right? Without spending much money, you can command the services of an awful lot of intellectuals, right? Intellectuals come cheap. And so a lot of foreign powers, right, they subsidize and essentially, buy off all sorts of our leading pundits.
Just because Donald Trump might be re-elected president, they ought to do it actually for their own economic as well as national security good. Now, what I tried to argue was that you can't view the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel in isolation. They're part of a bigger geopolitical picture.
Yeah, they're part of a bigger geopolitical picture where the United States acts and then other nations react, or other nations act and the United States reacts.
And in that picture, as we've discussed on GoodFellows before, there's a kind of axis of ill will. Behind Russia stands China. Without Chinese dual-use technology, the Russian war economy would have ground to a halt some time ago. Alongside Russia as a supplier of drones and other equipment is Iran. Russia is a player in the Middle East, has been since Barack Obama let them back in at the time of the Syrian Red Line crisis. And bringing up the rear, last but not least, is North Korea, also a source of weapons for the Russians. The tendency at the Munich Security Conference is to have a panel over there about Ukraine and a panel over there about the Middle East, and not to join the dots. One person who did join the dots, incidentally, was former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who gave a barnstorming speech I heard, in which he said, rather more forcefully than me, that we had to deal with these threats.
Right. Niall Ferguson wants them to join the dots so that they will collect to some sort of combined group effort against evil.
As a single global threat. And if we saw it that way, we would realize that it'd be folly to let Russia win in Ukraine and folly to let Iran win in the Middle East. And Iran wins in the Middle East if Hamas survive.
Wait, the title of this stream is I Think We're Alone Now. I don't know if I can handle this success. 29 live viewers on YouTube. Right. That's not even counting the 0 viewers on X. It's not even counting 1 viewer on Odyssey. That's not even counting the 1 viewer on Rumble. That's not even counting 2 viewers on Kick. My God, we're not alone anymore. Right? The secret meeting is being penetrated. I hope I don't start selling out.
Iran wins if a Palestinian state looks like a concession to terrorist action. Iran wins if the Houthis continue to disrupt trade in the Red Sea. Iran wins if Hezbollah is...
Guys, we can't allow Iran to win. Well, sometimes it's more in the United States' interest for Iran to win than for Iran to lose. Right? You back someone into a corner, right? If Vladimir Putin gets backed into a corner, he's 100 times more likely to use nuclear weapons than if Vladimir Putin is allowed some sort of winning, right? You want to allow people to win. I've been a blogger on and off, but more on than off for 27 years. And I've, penetrated deeply, various communities. And one strategy that I have employed to stay alive is to try to allow other people to win as much as possible, particularly my most strident critics, right? Give them a voice, let them feel like they're winning. Don't diminish people if I can possibly hold myself back from those sort of tawdry pleasures. Because when you allow other people to win, right, frequently you're more likely to win, right? You don't consistently win just because other people are losing. And backing Iran into a corner, backing China into a corner, backing Russia and Vladimir Putin into a corner, probably not in America's best interests. Right? Israel has felt backed into a corner by the behavior of Hamas. And so they have struck out violently, as pretty much every nation does when it feels like its survival is at stake.
Poised on Israel's northern border with a far larger arsenal than Hamas has ever possessed. Iran wins if militias in Syria and Iraq are also converging on the scene. And so I do think it's extremely important to notice these connections. When Putin invites, as you just said, Bill, Hamas and other leaders and other organizations' leaders, Islamic Jihad too, to Moscow, it's not so that they can watch the Tucker Carlson interview together and swap stories. This is part of a coordinated effort to undermine democracy and, more broadly, the Pax Americana. That's what's happening, and I'm kind of glad that Putin is so overt about it, because it makes it easier to persuade people these things are connected. And however you may feel about the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, and no doubt we should all feel compassion for those Palestinians who have nothing but loathing for Hamas and who are now in the midst of a war zone that Hamas created. Nevertheless, you have to
Oh, we should only have compassion for Palestinians who loathe Hamas. The reason that Palestinians support Hamas is because of the circumstance. It's not some inherent quality, some inherent supernal transcendent quality of Hamas. When your situation's dire, right, the enemy of your enemy becomes your friend. And so that's why Palestinians, to the extent that they support Hamas. It's not because of the particulars of Hamas's brutality against Israelis on October 7. It's people look for a group that's going to champion their interests. Different people have different interests. If your life is terrible, if you see few, if any, prospects for your people to thrive, right, you're very likely to lash out. And Hamas lashes out, and many Palestinians think that Hamas is fighting for them. And therefore, people will tend to look at the world in terms of who is doing what to whom, right? Who is on my side? The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
understand. Israel must defeat Hamas as surely as Ukraine must not lose to Russia. This is a global challenge we confront, and it extends all the way to the South China Sea, to the Philippines, to Taiwan.
Dan Rafa.
Yeah, so I'd say two things just on Neil's point. I mean, if you think about who Putin is inviting to Moscow, the idea that any of these factions could one day populate the leadership of a Palestinian state is so preposterous. So start with Hamas, where Yahya Sinwar has been saying since October 7th that there are more October 7th.
Okay, so Israeli terrorists eventually, took governing positions with the new Jewish state of Israel, right? You didn't get this new one Jewish state just by singing songs, by holding hands, by reciting poetry, right? The modern Jewish state of Israel was created in part through committing acts of terrorism against the British who were occupying the land at the time.
Follow. So it's not like he's been jostled in any way, at least in his public statements. Says he would do it again. You have Khalid Mashal, who's one of the leaders of the political wing of Hamas outside of Gaza, who 2 weeks ago was in Turkey and gave an interview, and he was asked about a two-state solution.
Like, why would they not hate the Jewish state of Israel? Right? It's a humiliation to them that there's a Jewish state of Israel on land that they believe belongs to their people. Of course they're going to hate the Jewish state.
And he said there's no two-state solution. He says it's a one-state solution, meaning the Palestinians, Hamas, will be in charge of the one state, and that one state.
Yeah, the more dire your circumstances, the less likely you are to compromise, less likely you are to cooperate and have vigorous intercourse with outgroups. Right? Do you think Larry David would be having vigorous intercourse, with some Palestinian woman operating some, chicken shop if he were living in the Jewish state of Israel and, fighting for his life?
State, to quote Khalid Mashal, was from Rosh Nikra up in Israel's north all the way to Eilat in the south, and of course from the river to the sea. So he wanted to be clear, he wasn't just talking about the river to the sea, he was also talking from north to south, one state solution. So that's Hamas. Then you have the Palestinian Authority, obviously Palestinian Islamic.
Yeah, every living thing tries to create an environment around it that is best suited for its thriving. And I don't think we should be surprised that many Palestinians, many Arabs, many Muslims don't think that what's most conducive to their thriving is a safe, secure, thriving Jewish state in their midst.
Jihad is another version of Hamas, so same version. Then you have Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Ramallah, which has yet, by the way, to condemn what happened on October 7th. Repeatedly cajoled and consulted and has refused to condemn October 7th. The Palestinian Authority, which still...
Yeah, why would people condemn someone who's the enemy of their enemy? It doesn't matter how distasteful, ugly, immoral, other groups are. People primarily decide who they support and who they oppose on the basis of their own group's best interests, right? Most people are essentially tribal. Different tribes have different interests.
Still has in place its policies to monetarily reward any Palestinian who attempts Palestinian violence, terrorist violence against Jews. The name's...
Yeah, because due to two peoples fighting it out for control of one narrow strip of land, right, you have such an intense conflict of interests that a large number of people on each side want the other side to disappear. Most Israelis wish that the Palestinians would disappear. Most Palestinians wish that Jewish Israelis would disappear.
Still name streets out of terrorists. They still provide monetary reward to families of terrorists who die in service of jihad, of slaughtering Jews. You look at the textbooks in the schools in the West Bank, they're full of indoctrination of Jew hatred. So there's no sign that by the way, when I speak to officials in Gulf countries, in Sunni Gulf countries, they also say that Mahmoud Abbas...
Yeah, because you've got a circumstance that creates mutual loathing. And until that circumstance changes, you're not going to change the mutual loathing.
And the Palestinian Authority is hopeless. There's no way that they could be the leaders of a future joint Palestinian state. So who are these factions? I have yet to hear of a single player being invited to Moscow.
So I don't want to turn around this jacket. Thank you, Laponia. It's very kind of you. Ford looks like some kind of fashion model. WTF, man. Well, this suit jacket's like 25 years old. And if I turn around, it's like torn and dirty. But it looks good from the front. Just like me. Like there are circumstances, opportunities, situations where I look good. I often make a great first impression. I can really pull it together for an hour here, a few minutes there, right? But then people get to know me, and there are like all these cracks in my facade, right? I mean, all these women thought, oh, he's so charming, he's good looking, he's erudite, he's witty, and then, oh my God, have you seen his blog? And then they saw the 1982 Dodge van that I drove from what? I drove a 1982 Dodge van from 1997 until about 2014. Right? I drove around a 1-ton 1982 beat up, rusting Dodge van that for many of those years I kept a mattress in the back. And I remember this very memorable one, don't get in that van. And the response that I liked best was, well, I'll make him buy me dinner first.
Actually a real reformer that is willing to do the kinds of things that Neil's talking about in representing those Palestinian civilians that want some normalcy. And so I do think in that sense, it's clarifying. And I think our friends in the Biden administration who feel pressure to do something on the Palestinian state front, it is clarifying to say, these are the characters who are being gathered by, by Vladimir Putin, who you are rightly obsessed with. And it's clarifying about whose side, which player's on. In terms of Rafah, this war, Neil is right that the Israeli leadership is extremely focused on finishing this war and ending it, and they can't finish it.
So I like this style of shirt, and I just bought this same style of shirt that I always wear from Amazon, and then I saw. Tell me, can you notice this little unsightly bit here? And now I don't know if I can wear this shirt anymore. There's like a little tiny tear here, and I don't want to wear the shirt anymore. And I was almost tempted into doing something unethical, probably unethical. I was tempted to complain to Amazon. The shirt I just got from Amazon was delivered to me with a scratch on it, and Amazon's so awesome that they automatically send me a new one. But I figured the odds are 90% that somehow I created this little tear in this brand new shirt. I mean, I spent like $30 on this shirt, and now it's got this little flaw. And even if other people can't see it, I feel it. I don't feel as confident walking around in this shirt with this tiny little infinitesimal tear. And so what do I do? I'm not gonna ask for a refund on Amazon when I think the odds are 90% that I did this, but I don't want to throw away a $30 shirt. I mean, nobody's going to notice this, right? On the other hand, it's time to get this shirt dry cleaned, so that's going to cost $5. So why would I throw good money after bad and spend $5 dry cleaning this shirt? I'm impaled on the horns of a dilemma. I mean, can you even notice that little unsightly tear in the shirt? Everyone's going to notice it now, and I've got. I'm a very respectable man. Like I'm, as Laponia said, I'm a fashion plate, and bloody heck, I spent $30 on a brand new shirt. I only wore it twice, and then I see there's this little tear in it, and I don't know if anyone will, but I will notice. So where will my confidence go? Now, what about my self-image? What about my self-esteem? What about my reputation with myself? Walking around in a flawed garment. I mean, the crack, the flaw, the rip, the tear in this garment, and it symbolizes a crack, a flaw, a rip, a tear in my soul. People will see the flaw in this shirt, and they will recognize that I'm similarly torn and ripped and flawed inside once you get past the dazzling smile and upbeat, cheerful personality. I will be exposed. I take it to a dry cleaner, whatever they do for $5. Now, it's not a laundry, it's a dry cleaner. So, perfect old guy bemoans imperfect shirt. What do? Do I go ahead and spend $5 dry cleaning a shirt with a tear in it that cannot be repaired?
Without going to Rafah, they just can't. There's close to 20 Hamas battalions, according to the Israeli leaders, that have been wiped out. There's still a few more, and they can't wipe them out unless they get to Rafah. Unfortunately, there's well over 1 million Palestinian civilians currently concentrated in Rafah. Everyone's putting pressure on Israel to figure out some kind of humanitarian corridor to get these Palestinians, or a bunch of them, out of the area and get them up to North Gaza. That is hard to do logistically. Israel's trying to do it. The risk, obviously, when you do that is a lot of bad actors will get out of.
Look, let's stop talking about this gay Arab-Israeli conflict. Here's another dilemma, right? It's typically the high temperature in wintertime. Los Angeles is typically around 64 degrees. Low temperature, typically around 45. So walking around with a collared shirt, even with a black T-shirt underneath, and my seat is not enough. Where are my seats? Oh, here. Like, it's not enough. I need a very light long sleeve T-shirt to go on top of it. So I like these very light long sleeve T-shirts that I get off Amazon. Right. But my sister doesn't like this. And so she bought me instead this very heavy sweater. But I need something more than just my long collared shirt, my T-shirt, and my seat. I like this really light long sleeve black T-shirt, but my sister doesn't approve, and my sister has far better clothing taste than I do. So she bought me this, and she wants me to wear this, heavier sweater instead of that delightfully light. Now, I just feel like I am being bathed in God's love when I wear this light long sleeve T-shirt, but it doesn't look as good as this heavier sweater, right? Okay, forget the jacket. I can't really wear this red shirt just as a red shirt. I need to subdue the red with a lot of black. And this looks better, but it's heavier and it's not as comfortable. I like being embraced in God's love, and that's what I feel like when I wear my light long sleeve black T-shirt. But it's not classy. And if 40 is anything, he's a very classy, respectable man.
Rafah and get up to the north. So how Israel does this in a way that doesn't have bad, Hamas, remnants of Hamas sneaking up and getting safe haven up in the north, in the northeast of Gaza, back on Gaza's border with Israel is difficult. So I think this Rafah situation is going to be ugly, and it is necessary. And exactly what Neil said, the Israeli leadership that keeps saying we are going into Rafah is important, not only because they probably do have to go into Rafah, but it's also sending a message. The international community and pressure from the international community has been unleashed on Israel. Every part of it, right? The EU, the UN, the media, the NGOs, obviously now increasingly the Biden administration. They're all pressuring Israel, saying you cannot do Rafah, and Israel is saying we're.
Oh, it's so surprising why they pressure Israel. Like, who could imagine that? What would they possibly thinking? That's so crazy, man. Why is the international community concerned that Israel killed 29,000 Gazans? Cray. Like, he talks as though it's insane, that it's unmerited, that there are no legitimate reasons why various nation states and people are concerned about Israel killing 29,000 Palestinians. And I'm not taking a strong position on whether Israel should invade Gaza and whether Israel was particularly reckless. It does seem to me Israel was particularly reckless with the lives of Palestinians. Yes. Right. I find 29,000 dead Gazans a disturbing number. So I have sympathy. I have sympathy for the international community saying, hey, Israel, you can't keep slaughtering tens of thousands of Palestinians, right? That's not a completely absurd concern.
We're doing Rafah. And I think that sends a very.
On the other hand, I have sympathy for supporters of Israel saying, wait, you're just going to allow right, terrorists to come and send rockets into Israel and come in and slaughter 1,200 of our citizens, and we're not supposed to protect ourselves? I think that's a very strong argument too. So I'm not taking one side in this fight, but I am saying that this idea that international concern about the death of 30,000 Gazans is not an absurd concern.
Important message to Senor and the people around him, like, wow, we believe we could catalyze a massive international response after October 7th that would put pressure on Israel to show some restraint. We knew they'd have to respond in some way, but to have to show some restraint. And the Israeli leadership saying, no, we're even going if we have to go in Ramadan, is sending a message that you're unleashing everything on us, right? You're sending genocide cases to the ICJ. You're throwing everything at us, and we're still going.
Okay, this is Dan Senor, who wrote a book about 10 years ago about Israel's high-tech economy.
That's a very important message, not only to the Hamas leadership, it's also an important message to all those regional actors that Neil talked about. And I just want to say, early on in this war.
Yeah, Israel is saying, you don't do this to me. We are coming back to Gaza 1,000 times if we have to. When Gazans look up, they see a face like mine looking down at them.
War. There was a big debate about whether Israel should move quickly to negotiations for the hostages. And Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, argued very strongly that Israel would do best on negotiations for hostages if they move aggressively militarily, quickly. That is to say, Israel's negotiating position, to the extent that they have one, will be strengthened by a strong military response, and will be strengthened by Hamas believing that Israel is willing to do whatever it has to do to wipe out Hamas and get the hostages back. And he believes he's vindicated. Gallant. He has said this publicly. He believes that the deal they got in the first round, which most on the Israeli side believe on that first round of hostages released was a good deal for Israel, was made possible because Israel.
Well, great. Now I'm down to 24 live viewers on YouTube, even though I've added 2 on X, and I've now got 3 on Rumble. Have I kept the one on Odyssey? Yes, I still got the one on Odyssey. But I'm the only viewer on Kick.
Moved so aggressively on the military front and convincing the people around Senor that Israel was willing to move aggressively. And I think that the statements you're hearing them articulate on Rafah are of that same strategy.
I ask, the north end of Gaza seems like a terrible place to spend 6 months while Israel cleans out the south end. The obvious place to go is Egypt. And it's interesting that the Arab states, who say they want to get rid of Hamas and say they care about the Palestinian people, will nonetheless not let a single one in. I saw a picture of border wall that Egypt has.
It's amazing what they're building. It would be like Donald Trump's
dream
dream.
to have a border wall like that. But yet a little bit of pressure from the US. Okay, you care about Palestinians? Let them have a place. Now, obviously, we know this game. They are playing the game of increased Palestinian suffering as a deliberate.
So why does no neighboring state want to take in Palestinians? Because of the behavior of Palestinians, right? Palestinians, through their choices, through their deeds, have created a situation where no neighboring state is incentivized to allow them in. If Palestinians had behaved differently, right, other nation states would have reacted differently.
Deliberately increased Palestinian suffering as a weapon against Israel. I want to ask you the economic question, though. How long can Israel hold out? If this will go on for months more. You got every country in the world, including the U.S., now giving up on them. You wrote a book on the Israeli economy, prosecuting war as there's more and more sanctions, more and more, whatever comes from the rest of the world, and perhaps a second front. It's going to be hard for Israel. How do they do it?
So, just on your first point, it is true that Egypt. And I agree with you, John. I'm amazed that there has not been more focus on the lengths Egypt is going to prevent any suffering Gazans into their country. The reason they're doing this not only because they want to prolong the suffering, but I think the more paramount, the overriding motivation is they don't want these people.
They don't want to do it because they don't want to legitimate the Jewish state and say that it's okay that Jews came in, developed their own state, and essentially pushed out my people
in their country. That's what it's about. They don't want. I mean, I spoke to an American official who was involved with getting out American Palestinians, so American citizens who are Palestinian that live in Gaza. And when the war began, October 7th, the U.S. government was focused. This got less attention, but the American government was focused on getting out these American citizens who were living in Gaza. And he described to me how they had to. The Egyptian government was so nervous about any Palestinian leaving Gaza and coming into Egypt that if the American government wanted to get out a U.S. citizen that was Palestinian living in Gaza, the U.S. government had to provide its own personnel to personally escort that person, not only through the border, but once they're in Egypt, that American officials had to man the person in Egypt until they're in the airport and onto the plane and out. So it's like they do not want these people in their country. Which the idea that Israel gets these accusations of quote unquote apartheid and Egypt, if this really is their concern, Egypt could solve this overnight if they were willing to take in some Palestinian refugees. On the economic front, so the worrying news is I'm not worried about Israel's tech sector. Let me start with that. So there's about 400 plus multinationals with major operations in Israel, and it's all the big companies, Google, Meta, Intel, Apple, and then also a lot of non-tech companies like Procter & Gamble and major auto companies. All 400 plus major multinational companies have very expansive operations in Israel. Not a single one of them has announced they're shutting down since October 7th. So I think that speaks to the deep tech and the deep innovation that their R&D centers in Israel are doing. You don't just unplug that quickly. So the good news is they're saying they seem to be sticking it out. And some of them made very strong statements about why they're sticking it out. The venture capital, Israel is attracts more global venture capital globally on a per capita basis than any country in the world. Obviously, it's down, but it's also down globally. So it's hard to disentangle what's a secular trend in terms of global venture capital fundraising, in terms of what's going on in tech globally versus what's happening in Israel and its war. The downside that I'm more focused on is just the simple reality that somewhere between, for the last 4 months, somewhere between 10 to 30% of senior executives of most tech companies in Israel have been called up to fight reserves. And there's just the reality that head of business development that was working on closing a deal with an American company or some marketing, they're just not there. They're gone for 4 months and they're fighting, and stuff falls through the cracks. And that segment of the economy, which is the engine of the economy, takes a hit. That's inevitable. Now, partly because of the economic pressure, the reserves are coming back, meaning they're being reintegrated to society. So most of the fighting in the near term, and that could change, but most of the fighting in the near term is going to be the regular army and not the reservists. So hopefully that pressure on the tech companies is going to go down. We'll see though. Because there could be other fronts that open up, talk about the north. I mean, there's other stuff that could happen where Israel will be back in again, having to call up hundreds of thousands of reservists. I think, and this is not me trying to look at this with rosy-eyed lenses. I will say though, when I wrote Startup Nation, we looked at Saul and I looked at the history of like the 91 Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein was launching Scud missiles into Israel that the Israelis believed could be laced with chemical weapons, and the whole economy shut down, and everyone was in gas masks and sealed rooms, and the tech innovation and the interdisciplinary skills and the kind of initiative taking mindset that came out of that period helped fuel a tech boom for the next couple of decades. It's not by accident that international investors view Israeli entrepreneurs as the most resourceful. They are unique. Mine and Neil's mutual friend Eric Schmidt told me when he was at Google. He said if you take the average Israeli 25-year-old and you put him or her up against their peers anywhere in the world, he told me at the time, this was around 2008, 2009, Google will hire the Israeli 25-year-old any day of the week because they just have a level of maturity and interdisciplinary skills and leadership during pressure and crisis management skills that no young tech executives have anywhere in the world. He says Google will hire the Israeli over anyone else any day. There's just no comparison. So if you think about what these tech executives that are being called up are dealing with now, many of them in their 30s and 40s, now they're going back to their tech companies. And I just think, I wouldn't wish this upon any of them, but the reality is many of them you're going to see a whole other level of maturing crisis management skills. And so I think ultimately in the long run, the Israeli tech economy is going to be fine. My bigger question is Israel's military industrial base. I think that one wake-up call for Israel these last few months is how dependent it is on the U.S. for munitions and other defense capabilities. And it's not to say that the U.S. government is playing games with them politically. I do not think they are. I think the Biden administration is actually very strong on this front. They're trying to get Israel whatever Israel needs. And the White House has gone to extraordinary lengths, despite in the face of dysfunction in Congress, to get them what they need. But the reality is there are supply chain issues in the U.S. that Israel can't do anything about. There's other priorities the administration has vis-a-vis Ukraine that Israel can't do anything about. And I think there is this wake-up call. I picked this up in a bunch of meetings I was in, that Israel needs to pivot dramatically and quickly to building out its own military industrial base. And that I think ultimately that's probably good for their economy. But in the short term, it's a huge pivot. It's going to require a big increase in defense spending. And that will have real economic implications that I think could be quite costly.
So let's leave it there, gentlemen. Neil, I hope you have a column in the near future. You've been to Kyiv and you've now been to Jerusalem, and I think a contrast between the two wartime footage would be fascinating to read about. So hopefully that's somewhere in your mind right now.
That is actually what I woke up at 4 in the morning thinking about, Bill. That is exactly the contrast that I'm going to write about for my column on Sunday. It's a fascinating one. I'll tell you one thing just to sign off on this topic. Ukrainians' global communications are so far vastly more successful than Israel's. Ukraine has really aced global communications, and everyone here admits, they're quite clear about it, that this has gone horribly wrong. And I think one thing I'm struck by is that Israelis are shocked at how unpopular they've become, particularly amongst young people on both sides of the Atlantic. This has been a rude awakening. They can learn something from the way the Ukrainians do this, and I've been offering some tips based on my trips to Kyiv.
Excellent. Look forward to it, Dan. It's proof that no good deed goes on. Okay, so my favorite song for the past month is by S Club. Sun is high. It's the start of a long, hot summer. And for you and I, hanging out with each other since the early days, always being close when it mattered, look how much we've changed. And if someday we find we ever have to say goodbye, we'll be running back these memories to relive time after time. Because these are the days of our lives that we'll always remember. These are the craziest times that we've been through together. These are the days we'll always remember. Take care. Bye-bye.